Hello and welcome to the Last Week's Say podcast. My name is Stephen White, and on this week's show, we delve into David Bowie's heroes and track his transition from maximalism to minimalism and the impact it left on his career. But first, you remind me of the babe. What babe? The babe with the power. What power? The power of voodoo. Who do you do what? Remind me of the babe. I saw my baby. Not my words, but the words of Yareth, King of the Goblins, in Jim Henson's 1986 classic movie, Labyrinth. Now, dear listener and dear viewer, you may be asking, Steve, why are you quoting a Goblin King in a 1986 Muppets movie or Puppets movie from many years ago? Well, dear listener and dear viewer, this week we'll be talking about David Bowie's heroes and his journey from maximalism to minimalism through the Berlin era to mark what would be, on day of recording, the 9th anniversary of David Bowie's passing. Yes, a song born out of the shadows of a divided Berlin, it became an anthem of resilience, transformation and hope. It was more than just a song for David Bowie. It was an essential part of his artistic background, transforming him from that maximalism pop star aesthetic to the artist that we know today. An essential step in what was an incredible career. Today, we're exploring the story behind Heroes, the Berlin trilogy, and how this period shaped Bowie's legacy, and even led to his haunting masterpiece, Ashes to Ashes. As always, a disclaimer at the beginning of this week's podcast. This is very much a vibes podcast, and Last Mixtape likes to look at things a little bit differently and in a kind of an artistic merit. I am a massive and huge David Bowie fan from birth. Those records were played to me, especially Starman, which was a song I demanded to be played and thought was about me when I was growing up as a kid. And yeah, for sure, the works of David Bowie have always been something of an inspiration for me. But I will say at the very beginning of this podcast, I don't know what time of day it was when he recorded Heroes, and I don't know what he had for breakfast, and I don't know what he was thinking. So this is more a delve into the aftermath and the critical and the kind of cultural aspect that a song and indeed this period in David Bowie's career would have. So that's what we're delving into. It's a little bit of a conversation between you and me about one of my favourite artists to mark what, as I say, would have been the 9th anniversary of his passing and his birthday as well, which was a couple of days before, I believe, on the 8th of January. By the mid-1970s, David Bowie's career, he had already reinvented himself multiple times. He had shown himself to be the chameleon that he was, obviously starting his career with, well, what we would know as Space Oddity. Before that, he kind of tried out a few different songs, some of which were kind of parody type songs, but he found his feet with that and moving through the rest of the albums and into what was Ziggy Stardust, which really caught fire for him and caught fire for his career. The flamboyant glam rock of Ziggy Stardust, and then moving to the sleek kind of abstract soul, blue-eyed soul of Young Americans. He was already this chameleon character, but by 1976, David Bowie wasn't just changing personas, he was a person in crisis. Those years of incredible fame and public attention and on the road and drugs had taken its toll on Bowie, and he looked to escape. Addiction, paranoia and creative exhaustion had all really come to a head for Bowie in this time. And he looked to escape to Berlin, a city itself fragmented and tense under the East and West German divide, and obviously divide within the city of the Berlin Wall. Also an opportunity for David Bowie to strip everything back that he had done in the last couple of years, from the Thin White Duke, Aladdin Sane and Ziggy Stardust, into something that was more stripped back and minimalist, something that mirrored the very city he was in. After the experimental low, Bowie returned to Hansa Studios in Berlin to record Heroes. Situated right by the Berlin Wall, the location itself infused the music with tension and urgency seen in the city. Full disclosure, Low is one of my favourite David Bowie albums, and it's really the one where you see that kind of, obviously you see it in Young Americans and you see it in records where his willingness to completely reject what he's done before and completely move away from it. He does that in Young Americans, as I say, being kind of the sleek R&B, wide, blue-eyed soul kind of singer, from the kind of the pompous glam rock alien kind of character that he was incredible. And it's no more so incredible in Low, which is this minimalist record, half of which could be maybe slightly described as a Brian Eno record, with Warsaw and the more ambient features on the second side of the record. And it is a complete departure and it's a complete rejection. You have to remember that this is in a very short period of time. This isn't about 4 to 5 years that he has moved so drastically from one to the other. We were talking about last week about U2, the move from Joshua Tree to Octone Baby, and how it's probably actually somebody in the comments was saying it's so easy to think that that was such an easy transition now looking back on it. But at the time, it was so sharp a turn. Well, this is an incredible amount of turns from an incredible artist. And as we were just saying, he was in a bad place when recording Low and beginning to record Low. Also, just a very special shout out to an incredible video by Adam Buxton, who in these podcasts used to do David Bowie impersonations. And there's a really cool animated video of Bowie and Visconti and Eno, who we'll all get onto in a minute, recording Warsaw. And I think it's, and it's about, as well, it earmarks the train journey David Bowie went on with Iggy Pop to Poland and the influences of it. But the record was and is incredible, Low. And it's this incredible way in which David Bowie is creating a back catalogue in real time that will allow him to move on to other things. And this essential period of David Bowie's career, the change from the maximal to the minimal, allows him to do everything after. And we know that he would go on to do poppier things after, but this cornerstone to me is Low. It shows an artist so willing to remove himself so much and remove himself almost in times from the record. As you say with Warsaw, he's doing these kind of vocal bits that are that I believe are kind of just ad-libbed sounds, and kind of removing himself from the center of it and becoming one with the music and one with the sound. And it's an incredible record. Heroes, the song, is the zenith of that entire process and entire period. Now, the real interesting thing about this period as well is David Bowie, as I just said, was working with Visconti, Eno, and essentially on this song, and the incredible guitar work of Robert Fripp. The kind of eternal guitar sound that you hear behind it, which I always thought was an influence for With or Without You. And I know Brian Eno worked on both of them with two very cool guitarists in The Edge and Robert Fripp. But I think the Robert Fripp one is really interesting because when you hear him talk about it, he talks about walking around the studios in Hansa and using the room. And we're talking about how Heroes is so influenced by Berlin, so influenced about the tense divide of the city, the Cold War, the communism and the capitalism in this condensed space, and that Robert Fripp is exploring the studio and creating these notes by standing in certain places with feedback. That kind of creativity is incredible. It should be also said when David Bowie records the vocal of it, and there's these gated vocal sounds. So he has, one vocal mic like this one, very close up to him, probably in a better position because this is actually bad mic technique, and then two more further down, and they would open the louder he sang, and they would open the reverb of Hansa Studio itself to become a part of it. So the city and the studio are very much parts of this sound. And obviously Brian Eno, this kind of mad genius character that, as I say, was such a big influence on Low, his minimalist sound really comes to the fore and really melds with David Bowie. And he's always been great at finding people, whether or not it was Mick Ronson or Carlos Almodovar, who is the guitarist and still guitarist in this, but in the Young Americans era as well. There's a great story in one of the documentaries about the making of this record, in which I think Carlos is talking about working with Brian Eno, and Brian Eno is pointing to a whiteboard or something, or a chalkboard with chords, and getting all these incredible players to just play chords and then and change them, and this kind of rigidity that Brian Eno would bring to the record. And obviously Tony Visconti's incredible production, and again a shout out to the Adam Buxton cartoon about it, where Tony Visconti is like, I'm probably doing a lot more than people think I'm doing, but yeah, it's an incredible period, an incredible time. Heroes for me is the zenith of that. Not only to me is it the best song off that, I think Low's the best album, Heroes is the best song, Lodger is, it's good. It's the it's the nadir of it. It's the period where you go, okay, this is it now. but the way the song melds with its surroundings, the way that Bowie's, I think it's his best written lyrically his best written song, and how he captures the sound of a city, which is something that always happens. It's interesting we talk about Warsaw from Low, because what would eventually become Joy Division would name themselves after that song, and that kind of, they were a band that captured the sound of the city. In their case, it was Manchester, and working with Martin Hannett. But Bowie really captures the sound of it, and these, the idea of the wall, this dividing thing that people can conquer, and that you can't take away love from the equation, and you can't take away freedom from the equation, and just you can't take the moment from people. You can oppress people, you can hurt people, you can do all of these things, but you can't take their essential humanity away from them. And it's such a powerful message. It's brought to life even more by whilst Bowie was writing the lyrics. This is a story Tony Visconti shares, that he spies Visconti and a lover embracing actually in the shadow of the Berlin Wall itself, and is inspired to write the lyrics about these two characters, about these two people, and envisioning them as something greater within the confines of Hansa and of Berlin and of his own life, as I say, which was in a lot of turmoil at the time. The minimalist sound of David Bowie's Berlin trilogy didn't come out of nowhere. It was the result of deep immersion in the avant-garde music of the time and the cultural undercurrents of Berlin itself. To understand Heroes and the Berlin trilogy, you have to understand what Bowie was listening to and how he was collaborating with it. And this pioneering electronic sound that would meld itself in with the kind of rock sensibilities of Bowie is an incredibly influential one on not only his career, but the careers of others. Eno was introducing Bowie to, as I say, the sounds of Kraftwerk and Autobahn and records like that, but also to people like Philip Glass and Steve Reich. It's interesting that I believe, and we'll talk about John Cage a little bit here, but Brian Eno once, it's one of my favorite quotes, and I can never find where it is, so it may not actually be a quote. It may be something I made up in my head. But I do remember reading somewhere Brian Eno describing John Cage as an Arctic explorer, and the idea being, in a kind of an artistic way, that it was good to know that there were people out there exploring the very far reaches of what music and art can do, but he would much rather stay in the south of France and, kind of in a comfortable space. And I think that's really interesting, that the two kind of ways of looking at it, and they're both two incredibly artistic people. But I think you can feel that influence where Eno never goes with his production, and again with Tony Visconti there too, and you can see that with his work with U2, having the help of Daniel Lanois. He never strays so far away into like just art music where you can't follow it, even though Low does go that way. You can see in Heroes, it's a blues song, that ba-da da da ba-da da ba-da. It's a blues song, it's a blues riff, and everything, and it's the magic around it, and it's the magic of the performance, and it's the magic of what Eno and Visconti and Bowie and Fripp are able to draw out of what would be, probably, if you could put it in, Ziggy Stardust, or you could put it in Aladdin Sane, would just be a rock song. And just the idea of these incredibly artistic people coming together through these influences, through this time, through the city itself. Because it wasn't just the music that was inspiring Bowie. Berlin's stark divided landscape also played a role. Bowie described the city as a city of tension, but with an undercurrent of hope. And I think, again, this is where Heroes captures this the most, that undercurrent of hope. You can feel there's an oppression in Heroes. You can feel there's something above putting its hand down on the essential characters that were influenced by Visconti and his lover. But you can also feel that there is that hope of, we can be heroes if just for one day. We can be us. And that governments and oppression and war and all of these terrible things that have such a horrible effect on who we are can be overcome, if not forever, but at least for a moment. And that idea of being oneself, and that can play into the city, into the Cold War, into the vibe, but I also believe it plays into Bowie himself, that he was trying his best, and obviously he went from one addiction to another, and I don't want to fixate on his addictions. I think there's too much made of that. He's an incredible artist, but that war within himself of trying to find those moments of, I can be me, I can be David Bowie, I can be Davy Jones, I can be that human being. I'm in here somewhere and amongst everything, and that stripping back into the rawness of it, in a city. And we think of Berlin now and as this incredibly cosmopolitan city. This is not the city that David Bowie was in, and this is something very different he was in at the time, and it wasn't what it is today. And it's that starkness and tension and minimalism that seeped into every note of this Berlin trilogy. It should be said as well. You say Berlin trilogy, a lot of this was recorded in different places, different spaces, not just Hansa studio, but also in Switzerland and things like this. But it's colloquially known as the Berlin trilogy. The Berlin era wasn't just about sounds. It redefined Bowie's entire image. Gone were the theatrical costumes and persona. This was a Bowie who was vulnerable, introspective, and unafraid to embrace imperfections. Indeed, this shift in sound would catch people unawares, and especially critics, especially with Low and in the movement from Low to Heroes to Lodger. We kind of see a shift back into what you would, generously call pop in a way. I suppose Heroes is probably the poppiest song to come out of this period. Yeah, I would say Heroes is the poppiest song to come out of this period. He thinks to himself. It's Breaking Glass. Maybe. I think Heroes is probably the one. So yeah, this was a difficult period, even for David Bowie fans, who were probably more fans of the Ziggy Stardust stuff and probably followed into the Young Americans kind of type of thing. But this was Bowie very much moving away from the central sound, and this caught people unawares. Why it's so interesting then, this kind of an essential to, I believe, to the rest of his career, because you can still hear, probably more than any other period that he played into, the kind of the aftermath of Berlin, the Berlin era, the Berlin trilogy in his work throughout his career. Even when he got to the poppier stuff later in the 80s, which, it should be said, people have different opinions of. We're talking about Heroes today and why I think it's one of his most important pieces of work. But Absolute Beginners is one of my favourite David Bowie songs. I'll die on that hill. That's an amazing song. So I love his poppier period. But the kind of the Berlin period and Heroes, and finding that kind of, as I say, having that basis of a song that is kind of a blues song, or has this kind of, this core to it, and that people can still relate to, that people can still find purchase in, but kind of adding bits and adding kind of sounds to it that are quite unusual. You can definitely hear that in the follow-up, not Lodger, but the follow-up to the trilogy, which is Scary Monsters and Super Creeps, which is Ashes to Ashes, which again, if you were to talk about in the pantheon of great David Bowie songs, Ashes to Ashes is up there. I always had this fascination with it. I remember the single, was it either my mother or my father's record collection? They had the single of Ashes to Ashes, and it had David Bowie dressed as a clown. Was it a drawing of him, or was it an actual picture? I can't remember, but it was this kind of photo, and he had the hat off, and maybe he was holding it, and he just looked so unusual. And I remember asking my parents about Ashes to Ashes, because it's such an unusual song. And again, it's a pop song. I mean, that chorus is incredible, but it's him wrestling with addiction, and it's him adding sounds that are so unusual. That main riff to it is such an unusual sound that you wouldn't immediately associate with something that is incredibly poppy, or that is even a hit or anything like that. And even the video is quite abstract, with him dressed as the Pagliacci kind of clown thing. And again, there's a great video Adam Buxton does as well of that one, where I don't know if it's a true story, where David Bowie talks about being dressed as a clown, walking down a beachfront, followed by a bulldozer, and this old man walks past him with a dog, and it ruins the take or whatever, and David Bowie goes sit down, and the director goes, "Oh my God, you just ruined the shot. You not know who this is?" And I think the old man goes, "Yeah, it's some dressed up as a clown." And I think it's interesting. I don't know if it's a true story, but it's a really nice one. But it should be said, in Ashes to Ashes as well, David Bowie would revisit the character of Major Tom. What an X to break the ice, I want to come down right now. Ashes to Ashes, fun to funky. We all know Major Tom's a junkie. So he's still wrestling with it, even after the Berlin era, because the Berlin era, as much as he wanted to get away from addiction, it found him and followed him. There's a great quote by Ernest Hemingway about that, is that it doesn't matter what city you go to write, or wherever you go, your problems will follow you. And indeed they did in Berlin with Bowie. But Heroes is this, to me, this monument of an encapsulation of a city, an encapsulation of an artist. It's that real interesting meeting between the two, where the city and the artist are both in the same space and in the same feeling in the country. And I think that's why you see such reverence to Bowie there with the Berlin Wall and things like that, is this, that he was divided, he was in crisis, he was tense, he was apart from himself, and he was in a country that was very much apart from itself, divided not through the machinations of others. And I think David Bowie kind of felt that. And I think Ashes to Ashes, to me, if we're kind of going heroes, larger Ashes to Ashes, I think it's the culmination of the Berlin period. But you can still hear, even in Let's Dance, and always in Bowie's work, there is this kind of snarl to it. There's this feeling to it that something is underneath, something is not quite right. And that experimentation, and obviously Eno wouldn't work on Let's Dance, but that kind of experimentation would always be there in Bowie's work ever since. And that change, no matter what the sales were, no matter what the critical reception were at the time, was so essential to what we think of as Bowie today. People often think, and I think I said this when he died, I remember doing a panel once when he passed away, that we must not lose David Bowie to the iconography that people lost Elvis to. That he not be broken down into dress up, or that he be broken down into, you know, phrases and all of this types of things, and affectations and stereotypes of what people think David Bowie is. It's important that his art and what he did be captured and seen in the context of its time. Being as brave enough to do that, go off and make a Low, go off and make 3 albums that are not impenetrable but difficult, especially starting with Low, and be able to bring great music out of it, and probably your best work, to me at least, in terms of in terms of heroes, your kind of your seminal moment to a lot of people is incredible, and have the bravery to do that throughout your career, to continue and like continuously throw things off and go, I'm different now, I've changed, I am now this, I'm now that. You know, I think I've talked about it before, the famous moment where he's on stage with the Spiders from Mars and he goes, this is it, it's over. You know, I think maybe it's in my head, it's right before he plays Rock and Roll Suicide, and to say, I'm done. This section of my career is done. It's always something I've been so interested in. That idea of reinventing yourself and not being afraid of it, and embracing it, and embracing change in one's music. And you can see that throughout. And I think the Berlin period for Bowie is so essential to that, because you don't know what he would become if he doesn't do that. You don't know. He successfully dodges the glam rock bubble burst by just moving into soul music and brilliant soul music with young Americans, and then to take that and go, I'm going to go and make a record with Brian Eno and it's minimalist. You know, what do people think? And it'd be interesting if there's anyone in the comments who remembers that period and remembers the change, because that's such a huge and essential thing. But the bravery of Bowie is encapsulated in Berlin, and Berlin and Bowie are melded together in the sound of Heroes. The Berlin era wasn't just a phase in Bowie's career. It was a testament to his ability to evolve, to strip himself down to the core and rebuild from scratch. And in doing so, he didn't just reinvent himself, he gave us music that transcends time. So, what do you think of David Bowie's Heroes, and indeed the Berlin era as a whole? And what do you think of David Bowie? What is he to you? What period of his music, what character best encapsulates your love for David Bowie? Where did you hear him first? How did you connect with him first? Is Heroes the nadir or the zenith of his work? Is it actually Absolute Beginners? It is Absolute Beginners. Absolute Beginners is his best song. No, what is your favourite David Bowie work? How do you remember the work of David Bowie? And is the Berlin period as seminal in his journey and his back catalogue now as an artist as I believe it is? So it goes, and there it went. But before I go, thank you for listening and watching the Last Mixtape podcast here on YouTube, Spotify, and indeed on Apple. If you want to send any of your music through to the Count of Monty playlist, who shall return next week with new Irish music now that he has gathered up some bits from the very start of the year, please do send it on to Stephen@thelastmixtape.com, and I'll be sure to pass them on to him. But for now, that was the Last Mixtape podcast. You're the listener and the viewer. I was Stephen White. Hey, so long.